Racing. Humans have been racing each other for thousands of years, but particularly interesting was the introduction of automobiles. In 1886, the first automobile was invented in Germany. It was built by Germans, but what's more important is that the first American automobile was created in 1893 by Americans. Frank and Charles Duryea had designed the first American automobile, and it would go on to win the first ever auto race. Thanksgiving Day, 1895, H. Kohlschat, publisher of the Chicago Times-Herald, wanted to push more papers and promote the rising automobile industry. What better way to do this than to stage a race? This is a trend that would become prevalent in promoting automobiles. A couple months prior to the race, on July 9th, Kohlschat sent out an advertisement promising $5,000 to anybody who could create a practicable self-propelling road carriage. For some perspective, $5,000 in 1895 is equivalent to $180,000 today. This is all in a time where there isn't even a specified term to represent automobiles. Polling his readers later that month, Kohlschat published his highest voted on term, with a motorcycle coming out on top. The race itself consisted of a trip from Chicago to Evanston and back, totaling 54 miles. Despite having 80 participants initially scheduled to race, the day of the event presented severe weather challenges, with temperatures below 30 degrees Fahrenheit and fresh snowfall up to 6 inches. The unfavorable weather conditions led many to withdraw, leaving only 11 to compete. Coming in first place was Frank Duryea, maintaining an average speed of 7 miles per hour and completing the trip in 7 hours and 53 minutes. The race garnered a lot of attention, and between 1899 and 1909, 485 companies entered the automobile industry. This was a period of growth and adoption, but nobody could compete with what Henry Ford was about to do. Ford had set out to create an affordable and mass-produced automobile, and he did just that. By 1924, you could buy a Model T for just $260. That's like $4,500 in today money. Ford got more Americans in cars than ever before, and by the early 20s, more than half of all cars were Model Ts. The automobile was becoming a staple of the American household, with more than half of all American homes owning an automobile by 1930. The increase in access to automobiles, along with improvements in technology, allowed for the automobile to become ever more interconnected with an American culture. This became none more apparent than with the introduction of the Volstead Act. The 18th Amendment banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act was introduced in the United States in late 1919, and its goal was to provide teeth to the 18th Amendment. This piece of legislation allowed the federal government to enforce prohibition by enforcing penalties among those who violated the 18th Amendment. Instead of cracking down on alcohol use, these laws spawned countless criminal bootlegging operations. All of a sudden, selling booze becomes a very profitable venture, as long as you didn't get caught. And the best way to not get caught was to be fast. Let me tell you, Americans were up for this challenge. Moonshiners and Appalachian Mountain Boys began souping up their cars in order to outrun police. They would even upgrade their suspensions to carry greater loads of moonshine. Officer Joe Carter said that them boys would...
They put in, sometimes spend $1,000 just putting extra supports and airlifts and overload springs on the back.
$1,000 in 1920 is worth $15,000 today. That was money well spent. The more booze you could carry, the more profit you could make. These boys were poor and destitute before this opportunity arose. According to NASCAR legend and former bootlegger Junior Johnson, a bootlegger could make $350 to $450 a night on whiskey in the 50s. The ability to make hundreds of dollars from a single trip was life-changing. It's not hard to imagine these teenagers who grew up alongside the adoption of automobiles being more adept at working with them and understanding the opportunity in front of them. These cars would be so heavily modified, Tim Flock said.
And they'd be up like this, going up in the mountains, and when they put a load of liquor on it, they'd come back down.
While you might be able to spot a bootlegger's car, you definitely couldn't catch it.
It wasn't much of a contest. Guys pass you up at 150 miles an hour. You can't make 80. It's kind of a hopeless situation.
At that point, the cops can't even compete. They simply can't go fast enough. The only people who could compete were other bootleggers. And so that's what they began doing. They'd compete and see whose car was the fastest. Modern myth would have you believe that all these bootleggers got together, started tearing up cow fields, and that would later develop into stock car racing. This is a popular narrative that can be traced back to Sylvia Wilkinson's interviews with OG stock car drivers in the early 80s. In particular, Tim Flock explained to Sylvia Wilkinson how stock car racing began, saying something along the lines of,
They cut a place out in the open field and started racing on Sundays. No grandstands, no ticket sales, and they started betting on, man, I know I got the best car. My car outrun your car. This was actually the beginning of stock car racing down south.
As much of a legend as Tim Flock is, his story is anecdotal. Born May 11, 1924, he would have been about 9 or 10 when he was watching these events unfold. Daniel S. Pierce writes a more verifiable history in his book with a long-winded title named Real NASCAR, White Lightning, Red Clay, and Big Bill France. Oh, I happen to have this book right here! As told by Pierce, the origin of stock car racing is more multifaceted than bootleggers tearing up cow fields. One of those facets had to do with the particular culture of the region. During the Great Depression, many poor farmers in the Piedmont region were faced with a decision. The presence of factories and mills were ever increasing as modernization took a hold on America, and the opportunities to make a living as a farmer shrank. The cultural values of the region prized freedom, action, and violence. Confined to a tight mill working long hours under direct supervision starkly contrasts with the freedom that these people valued. The most lucrative way to sustain your cultural values and continue to make money was to produce and sell moonshine. Even after the end of Prohibition in '33, many counties remained dry, continuing to prohibit the sale of alcohol. In areas that permitted the sale, taxes could be very high, further incentivizing illegal alcohol. This is all not to mention that in the Piedmont region, distilling moonshine is a practice that had been going on for generations. For many families, moonshining was a way of life and a way to maintain an ever-decreasing culture. Now, when bootleggers would race, it wouldn't be in a cow field. It was more impromptu on highways and mountain roads. Bootleggers didn't just get together and invent stock car racing, but they had a big part in it. At stock car races, you could find bootleggers as mechanics, car owners, car drivers, track owners, financiers. Their working knowledge of cars, their lucrative ways of making money, and their ever-evolving culture all combined in a melting pot to create what would eventually become NASCAR. The legacy of automobile racing in America is quite interesting. Automobiles quickly took hold of the United States, replacing horses as a new utilitarian device. The rapid adoption of automobiles in the United States has in part to do with cultural values of individualism, freedom, and privatism. These ideals made the transition to automobiles a public endeavor where every individual sought to improve their own personal freedom and mobility by purchasing a vehicle. In the early 1900s, most individuals would be concerned with long-distance reliability, but in southern Appalachia, a counterculture developed. One focused on family, moonshine, and driving fast. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and share this video. And always feel free to leave criticism in the comments below.